October 10th, 1944. As the late afternoon sun beats down on the waters off Singapore, a Malay police patrol boat scours the waves. The captain nervously scans the horizon, replaying the stern orders from his Japanese overlords over and over in his head. There must be no repeat of last year's humiliating Operation Jaywick commando raid on Singapore harbor. Ahead, he spots what seems to be a local fishing junk. Grabbing his telescope, he reads the vessel's name, Mustika. Nothing unusual there. On board, a group of dark-skinned men wearing sarongs, just as expected. But the captain senses something isn't quite right. Erring on the side of caution, he gives the order to approach the junk. Beneath those sarongs, fingers slowly reach for hidden weapons. Suddenly, gunfire echoes across the waves as a hail of bullets flies in the patrol boat's direction. The captain and his crew leap into position. Those are no fishermen. The shadow of success. In September 1943, Operation Jaywick had dealt a major blow to the Japanese in Southeast Asia. 14 Allied commandos and sailors of the elite Z Special Unit had traveled from Australia in the small fishing vessel Crate before entering the supposedly impenetrable harbor of Singapore in tiny full boats and attaching limpet mines to Japanese transport ships under the cover of darkness. By morning, 6 enemy vessels lay sunk or damaged, their hulls torn open by the explosives. The success of this audacious mission provided a significant boost to Allied morale and left the Japanese in shock. By the dawn of 1944, the war was turning against Japan. The time was ripe for a fresh strike on Singapore, and nobody was keener to carry it out than the mastermind behind Operation Jaywick, 28-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Lyon of the British Army. Lyon had been forced to escape Singapore in 1942 after witnessing its fall to the Japanese firsthand. His wife and son had tried to take a ship to safety, but Lyon had received no word from them since, coming to the depressing conclusion that they had failed to make it out alive. Jaywick had been fueled in large part by Lyon's strong desire for revenge. Now, he was a hero, his triumph having earned him a promotion and a recommendation for the Victoria Cross. But Lyon had another motivation for planning a new attack. While visiting England for the first time in 7 years in early 1944, he received some shocking news. His wife and son were still alive, but were being held prisoner in the Fukushima internment camp in Japan. The war had become deeply personal for Lyon, his determination to strike back at the Japanese Empire now fueled by thoughts of his captive family. This time, he envisioned something far more ambitious. Operation Remount. Lyon's original proposal, codenamed Operation Hornbill, was breathtaking in scope. It called for Allied forces to secretly occupy the Natuna Islands between Borneo and mainland Southeast Asia, creating a base from which to launch devastating raids on Japanese shipping. Political complexities and resource constraints ultimately doomed this grand vision. Undeterred, Lyon scaled back to a more focused operation that would still dwarf Jaywick in scale and impact. The basic objective of Lyon's new plan remained the same as that of Jaywick, penetrating Singapore's harbor and attacking Japanese ships using limpet mines. However, this time, it was to be carried out by 23 men, nearly twice the size of the Jaywick team, equipped with cutting-edge technology. Instead of using primitive full boats to enter the harbor, they would use 15 one-man motorized submersible canoes called Sleeping Beauties. These steel vessels could travel underwater, allowing operators to approach their targets unseen. What's more, they could each carry up to 9 limpet mines, enough to sink 2 10,000-ton ships. However, the Sleeping Beauties had a range of only around 30 miles. Therefore, the crew would need to transport them in a submarine before transferring them to a local fishing boat, which would need to be captured to complete the last leg of the journey undetected. Undoubtedly taking inspiration from the large tiger he had tattooed on his chest, Lyon decided to name this new operation Remount, the Malay word for tiger. Next, he would need the right personnel. Lyon recruited 5 fellow veterans of Operation Jaywick, men who already understood the extreme risks involved in carrying out a mission of this kind. The rest were specialists, chosen for their unique skills: explosive experts, navigators, radio operators, and hardened commandos from both Britain and Australia. As training began in July 1944 at a remote camp near Exmouth, Western Australia, Lyon's confidence was infectious. As the mission's departure date approached, logistical challenges mounted. HMS Porpoise arrived in Australia from Ceylon on August 15th, but the special J containers designed to house the Sleeping Beauties had not arrived. Lion immediately called a conference to address the problem. Remount had to launch by September or risk missing its window of opportunity before the monsoon season. Meanwhile, the full boats that Lion had ordered as backup craft and escape vehicles arrived late from England and were found to be faulty, missing important parts. The team worked frantically to modify them, but precious little time remained for training with the equipment. Despite these setbacks, on September 11, 1944, HMS Porpoise departed Garden Island Naval Base, carrying the 23 men of Operation Remount. Through ingenuity and determination, they'd managed to load the Sleeping Beauties into the submarine through the forward hatch and accommodate them in empty torpedo compartments, something Lieutenant Commander Marsham, the submarine's captain, had maintained was impossible. When they finally arrived, the J containers were used to carry stores on the submarine's hull. The mission begins. After 12 days at sea, HMS Porpoise arrived at its first destination, the remote island of Marapas. This uninhabited speck of land would serve as the operations base and rendezvous point for the extraction. On September 23rd, with the submarine maintaining a safe distance, 2 of the men paddled ashore under cover of darkness to scout the terrain. To their surprise, they discovered the island wasn't deserted after all. Through his periscope the next morning, Marsham spotted 3 Malays with a canoe on the beach. This unexpected complication forced Lion to make his first significant alteration to the plan. To ensure their supplies remained secure, one of the men was ordered to stay behind on Marapas as a guard. HMS Porpoise then continued northwest along the Borneo coast. They needed to find and capture a native fishing vessel large enough to transport the team closer to Singapore. For 4 days, they searched the waters without success. The crew grew restless. To lighten the mood, the men fashioned a doll from a stick of carbon, a monocle, and a scarf, before performing a rain dance around it, hoping to conjure a suitable vessel. Whether by coincidence or cosmic intervention, their wish was granted on September 28th. Off the west coast of Borneo, they intercepted a junk called Mustika. 7 commandos boarded the vessel, while its 9 Malay crew members were transferred to HMS Porpoise. The submarine would return them safely to Australia, where they would remain for the duration of the war. Over the next 2 nights, the Remount commandos transferred themselves, their equipment, and supplies from Porpoise to Mustika. Conducting officer Major Walter Chapman departed with the submarine on October 1st, taking the Mustika's Malay crew with him. Lion now faced his next challenge. Unlike Crate, the boat used in Operation Jaywick, Mustika had no engine. They would be entirely dependent on winds and currents to reach Singapore, a much slower and less predictable journey. As with Jaywick, the commandos disguised themselves as Malay fishermen, dyeing their skin and wearing sarongs, hoping to blend in with local maritime traffic. Mustika sailed east, eventually reaching Marapas Island on October 4th. There, Lion made another critical decision. He divided his force, leaving 4 men on the island, while the remaining 19 continued towards Singapore. The plan called for Lion to return to Marapas with the entire team after completing the mission to await extraction by submarine, scheduled for early November. With favorable winds, Mustika made steady progress towards Singapore. By October 6th, they had reached the vicinity of the harbor, positioning themselves off the west coast of Pulau Batam. They were now just 11 miles from Keppel Harbor, their target. Lion ordered his men to prepare the Sleeping Beauties for deployment. The raid was set for the night of October 10th, giving them time to select the optimal targets and plan their approach routes. Fateful encounter. The day finally arrived. Just 2 hours before sunset, with last-minute preparations underway for that night's raid, a coastal Malay police patrol boat, Hey Ho, approached the Mustika. The Japanese had significantly increased surveillance in the region, employing local boats to monitor suspicious vessels. The exact reason the patrol boat approached remains unclear. Some reports suggest that Mustika flew the wrong flag. Others indicate the junk's size aroused suspicion. What is certain is that the Japanese now required vessels in these waters to display both the Japanese imperial flag and a red anchor on a white background, a newly implemented security measure that the commandos were unaware of. As the Hey Ho drew alongside, a moment of catastrophic misjudgment occurred. one of the Australian commandos panicked and opened fire on the approaching patrol boat, claiming the lives of several of its crew. At least one Malay officer escaped, swimming back to shore to report the incident. In an instant, the entire operation was compromised. Lion immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. The Japanese would soon be alerted, and every vessel in the area would be hunting for them. No matter how difficult it might be, they had to face reality. The mission would no longer be able to go ahead as planned. With characteristic decisiveness, Lion ordered the Mustika scuttled, along with the Sleeping Beauties. These sophisticated submersibles were top-secret weapons that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. As explosives ripped through the Mustika's hull, Lion made another crucial decision. He divided his remaining 19 men into 4 groups. 3 groups would make their way back to Marapas Island to await submarine extraction. Their journey would be perilous, over 70 miles of open water in small fullboats through territory now alerted to their presence. Meanwhile, the 4th group, led by Lion himself, would continue with a modified version of the original mission. The group prepared their fullboats for the dangerous journey into the heart of enemy territory, arming them with limpet mines salvaged from the Sleeping Beauties. Despite the compromised mission and drastically reduced force, Lion remained determined to strike a blow against Japanese shipping. The modified raid would have to be less devastating than planned, but it would demonstrate that Allied forces could still penetrate Singapore's supposedly impregnable defenses. Historical records differ on what happened next. Japanese reports intercepted after the war mention 3 unexplained wrecks off Singapore on Admiralty charts, suggesting Lion's team successfully sank 3 enemy vessels. Other accounts claim the explosions heard in the harbor that night were merely Japanese crews clearing shipwrecks. What is certain is that Lion's group made it back out of the harbor, their raid complete. The hunt begins. By now, the Japanese were mobilizing, assembling a punitive force of at least 100 soldiers, including Army, Navy, and native police personnel. Their orders were clear: find the foreign infiltrators and eliminate them. Meanwhile, the escape parties paddled through the maze of islands in the Riau archipelago. They couldn't take the direct route across the middle of the straits. The waters teemed with Japanese naval vessels. Instead, they island hopped, moving mainly at night and hiding during daylight hours. Lion divided his team once more. 4 of the men would stay on Pangkil Island, while he and the remaining 2 crossed the Riau Strait in darkness to Sor Island, which offered a better vantage point. On October 14th, the group on Pangkil was spotted by Japanese forces. However, by the time a search party was dispatched, the men had already moved on. They had learned from a friendly Malay that Lion's presence on Sor had been betrayed to the Japanese. 2 of the men headed for Tapai Island with the rubber raft, while the other 2 paddled to Sor to warn Lion. It was too late. A Japanese patrol was already en route. The commandos would have to fight their way off the island. At approximately 2 p.m., about 45 Malay volunteers under Japanese command landed on Sor. The island offered little natural cover. It was flat, with minimal undergrowth, providing excellent visibility from shore to shore. Lion and the 4 commandos now trapped there with him had only limited defensive positions. 2 of the men took cover in a shallow depression on the western side. One positioned himself in a small stone-rimmed trench, while Lion and another man climbed a rue tree to gain an elevated firing position. The 5 men nervously awaited the imminent arrival of the enemy, painfully aware that they would be vastly outnumbered, and their odds of survival would be slim. The Battle of Sor Island. As the patrol approached, the commandos opened fire. The initial ambush inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy troops, who were caught in the open. Incredibly, the 5 men succeeded in holding off the much larger force for several hours, using their Sten guns and carefully timing their use of limited hand grenades. However, as the battle raged into its 9th hour, the 2 men in the shallow depression suffered serious wounds. Unable to continue fighting effectively, they made the decision to escape while their comrades provided covering fire. Taking a full boat, the wounded pair paddled toward Tapai Island. At around 10 p.m., a second Japanese barge arrived with approximately 50 reinforcements. The odds were now impossible, and the battle intensified in the darkness. The muzzle flashes from Lion's elevated position in the tree eventually gave away his location. A Japanese grenade found its mark, exploding in the branches near him and his companion. Ivan Lion, the architect of the operation, was no more. The lone surviving commando on Sor Island managed to slip away in the chaos and find a hiding place. However, his escape was temporary. The enemy found and took his full boat, leaving him stranded on the tiny island, and he would soon be captured. The two wounded men who'd managed to leave Sor Island reached Tapaya Island, only to discover that their comrades had already departed after hearing the firefight. Alone, gravely wounded, with a single pistol and no ammunition, the two men faced a grim choice: risk capture and torture, or take their own lives. The next day, Japanese forces found them sitting upright, side by side, having taken their potassium cyanide capsules. However, by this time, a mission to rescue the surviving members of the operation had begun. The submarine HMS Tantalus was on its way from Fremantle, with Major Walter Chapman, the conducting officer who had returned to Australia on HMS Porpoise with the Mustika's Malay crew on board. But with Japanese patrols tightening their net, a race was now underway to see which side would reach the commandos first. Regrouping. Within 2 weeks, the 18 survivors of Operation Remount had gathered on Marapas Island. However, on November 4th, just days before their scheduled extraction by HMS Tantalus, disaster struck again when Japanese forces landed on the island. The ensuing firefight claimed the lives of 2 of the men. The remaining commandos split into smaller groups and escaped to nearby islands, hoping to regroup at the rendezvous point in time for the submarine pickup scheduled for 3 nights later. The terms of the extraction were unambiguous. HMS Tantalus would arrive at Marapas on the night of November 7th. If the submarine failed to make contact that night, it would continue returning to the island each night for 30 nights until December 8th. As night fell on November 7th, 10 of the commandos were in position, desperately waiting for the submarine that would carry them to safety. Yet HMS Tantalus did not appear. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Hugh Mackenzie, was known as an aggressive hunter with an impressive record of sinking enemy ships. He resented being diverted from combat patrols for a rescue mission. Despite explicit orders to rendezvous with the Remount party, he decided it was inappropriate to abandon an active patrol to pick up the party. Mackenzie chose to continue hunting for Japanese ships, justifying his decision on the basis that his original orders gave him a month's window for the pickup. Meanwhile, Australian intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications, revealing that Operation Remount was in trouble. Yet none of the officials who knew of the commando's predicament attempted to contact HMS Tantalus to emphasize the urgency of the rescue. HMS Tantalus finally arrived at Marapas on November 21st, 2 weeks after the scheduled rendezvous. Major Chapman and another man went ashore. They found evidence of recent occupation, the beginnings of a large lean-to shelter, empty ration tins, half-cooked food on commando cookers, and fires that appeared to have been hastily extinguished. Despite these signs, Chapman was reluctant to continue the search. His physical fitness had deteriorated after months confined in the submarine, and he showed little enthusiasm for the task. At one point, Chapman's companion reportedly aimed his gun at the Major, ordering him to continue searching for the Remount camp. Although they saw 3 Malay workers in the distance, they made no attempt to approach them or gather information about the commando's whereabouts. After a cursory search, Chapman and Mackenzie agreed that the operation had likely failed. Rather than following orders to return nightly until December 8th, Mackenzie simply resumed his patrol, abandoning the commandos to their fate. HMS Tantalus returned to Fremantle on December 6th, having never returned to Marapas Island. For the stranded commandos, the realization that they'd been abandoned was devastating. Once the December 8th deadline passed, they knew their only hope for survival was to attempt something virtually impossible: navigate nearly 2,000 miles through enemy territory to reach Australia. The Japanese close in. In their small groups, the commandos paddled south in their full boats, island hopping through the archipelago. Little did they know, the Japanese forces were intercepting their radio communications, tracking their movements as they scattered across the islands. As December progressed, the noose tightened around the scattered Remount commandos. Japanese forces, responding to intelligence and local informants, closed in methodically. On December 15th, one group was resting on Selajar Island when they were betrayed by locals. One of the men was shot in the hip and taken prisoner. The other 3 escaped temporarily, but were also captured within days. Elsewhere, scattered groups of commandos fought desperate battles across the archipelago. One skirmish saw 2 commandos surrender after one of them was badly wounded in the shoulder. In another firefight, the full boat was riddled with bullets and sank. One of the commandos who'd been on board was swept away by a fierce rip current and drowned. His body was never recovered. The other would meet an equally tragic end. After escaping to Jempa Island, he met up with 2 of his comrades, but received a bayonet wound to the chest when captured by the Japanese. Also suffering from severe malaria, he passed away in captivity a few days later. The remaining 6 commandos managed to acquire 2 small boats and attempted the daunting journey back to Australia. After sailing hundreds of kilometers along the southwestern coast of Linga Island, one of the boats encountered a Chinese junk, which took the commandos on board. However, it seems the junk's crew had a change of heart and attacked the men while they slept. 2 of the men were beaten and thrown overboard. Their bodies later washed ashore on Maja Island. The 3rd man leapt into the sea, spending 24 hours floating on the waves, and another day desperately clinging to a fish trap until local fishermen found him and handed him over to Japanese authorities on December 22nd. Meanwhile, the other boat continued its journey south. When one of the men fell ill with fever, the other 2 left him on a sheltered beach before pressing on. After an epic journey of over 1,800 miles, they reached Remount Island on January 17, 1945, only around 370 miles from Darwin, Australia. However, despite being so close to freedom, they were betrayed by a local chief and captured by Japanese forces. The 2 commandos were transported to Dili in East Timor, where they would both pass away in captivity in the following months. The only member of the 23-man team who was still alive and free was Private Warren, the commando who developed a fever and been left on the beach. Remarkably, he recovered from his illness and managed to survive in Karapangan for another 2 months, even commandeering a small boat. However, in March, he was finally captured by the Japanese and taken to Java. He passed away in prison the following month. The 10 surviving commandos remained locked up in Outram Road Prison in Singapore, where they were subjected to harsh beatings, used as practice dummies for guards practicing their martial arts, and starved on meager rations of rice. Disease ran rampant through the filthy cells, with many suffering from beriberi, scabies, malaria, and dysentery. The Japanese were particularly enraged to discover that some of the captives had participated in Operation Jaywick. On July 3, 1945, the 10 surviving commandos were put on trial for espionage and perfidy. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. All 10 were found guilty and sentenced to execution. 4 days later, on July 7th, the men were taken to Pasir Panjang to meet their destiny. Japanese records claim they met their fate with dignity. The reality was far more gruesome. Tragically, they were executed just 39 days before Japan's surrender and the end of World War II. Had they survived a few more weeks, they might have returned home as heroes. Legacy and Remembrance. For decades after the war, the full story of Operation Remount remains shrouded in secrecy. While Operation Jaywick was celebrated as a daring triumph, its tragic successor faded into obscurity. The families of the fallen commandos received only vague notifications that their loved ones were presumed not to have survived. After the war, British war crimes investigators exhumed the bodies of the 10 executed commandos from their unmarked graves at Pasir Panjang and reburied them at Singapore's Kranji War Cemetery. Controversially, they ruled that no war crimes had been committed, concluding that the men had, quote, voluntarily deprived themselves of the right to be treated as prisoners of war by discarding military dress and posing as Malays. This legalistic reasoning did little to honor the men's sacrifice or acknowledge the brutality of their execution. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Hugh Mackenzie, whose decision to delay the rescue mission likely doomed the stranded commandos, faced no consequences. Instead, he continued his career, eventually rising to the rank of Vice Admiral in the Royal Navy. Major Walter Chapman, the conducting officer who half-heartedly searched for the commandos on Marapas Island, carried the weight of his actions for years. Finally, in January 1978, a medal was designed to acknowledge the efforts of Z Special Unit members involved in Operations Jaywick and Remount. Called the Commando Cross of Valor, it represented belated recognition of their extraordinary courage. Today, modest memorials to Operation Remount can be found in Singapore. A plaque stands in the car park adjacent to Kranji War Cemetery, and another behind a bus stop along Dover Road, near the execution site.